Hello, YouTube. Yes, another Trey Jadlow video. It's been a while. How you guys been? So this is related to a post that Xboxfiend had made and a long interaction that Trey and I had. And it started off with Xbox talking about Jesus's two natures, the God nature and the man nature. And Trey wanting to say that the God nature is timeless, changeless, and necessary, but that the man nature was contingent. Xbox was challenging this, and I decided to bring in a bit of a modal collapse argument to engage Trey on the notion that a God who is necessary, who is the fullness of all of his properties, and by which there is nothing else extrinsic to inform his actions, that such a God would have any state of affairs it brought about that could potentially be otherwise. Anyway, you'll get the point of the argument as I get into it here. This is a text argument, so to keep it a little interesting, I did a bit of a dramatization. I was going to do some animation with it and whatnot, but I'm not going to bother with that because it's already kind of long. I mean, that would take some time, but it's a worthwhile one, in part because the point of the dialogue for me was to do an internal critique from Trey's position, examining the implications of his own positions. And actually getting him to commit to those was actually quite hard. He worms around quite a bit and wants to be able to say things and then withdraw from them. And I'll point that out, and I think you'll get the gist of that. But I did a bit of a dramatization to try to keep it interesting. It was no offense to Trey. It was just me being a little bit silly. And the other thing I wanted to say about it is that I'm going to, within the course of this conversation, I'm going to grant a lot to Trey. And that's because I'm really just interested in proving this one point. So whatever Trey wants to invoke, I'm willing to grant as long as it doesn't beg that question. He can invoke anything to get there. And you're going to see that. You're going to see me granting left and right. But still, it ends up being a long hangout, or a long chat, I should say, only because pinning Trey down is quite difficult. He doesn't want to deal with the implications of his words, but he wants to be able to opine and assent to certain things. So bear with it. It's a good interaction, and hopefully it teaches that Trey isn't someone you should have a hangout with. You should actually engage with him in text and hold him to his words. So this engagement with Trey ended up going much longer, but I didn't record all of it, believe it or not. We are still at this moment going at it, and I'll include a link to that post in the comments. Cheers and take care. Trey Jadlow would want to say, Jesus has a man nature is a true proposition. Is that proposition necessarily true, or is it contingently true? I'm guessing you'd say it's contingently true. If so, on what fact about God is it contingent upon? Could that fact about God be otherwise? If that fact about God could be otherwise, then is that to say God is not necessarily as he is? If that fact about God could not be otherwise, then is that to say Jesus has a man nature is necessary, given that the reason by which it comes about is necessary? Is predication necessary, Bert Poole? Predictable dodge is predictable. I thought you were a guy with answers, but all you seem to do is ask questions. Here's how it works. Trey argues X implies Y. You challenge X implying Y. Trey argues you can't speak to the implications of X, therefore Y. Case in point, Trey. God is necessary and derives X, which is contingent. Bert. If God is necessary, by virtue of what can X be otherwise? Trey. Are you predicating about God? Special pleading of the most obvious sort. Trey utters what is implied until a contradiction is entailed, and then insists we can't utter as to what is implied. Bert Poole, would you please just answer the question? Trey Jadlow, would you please just answer the question? Ironic. And per usual, I'll be the guy who actually answers Trey's questions while he fails to offer explanation for his claims. With necessary being defined as no reason by which it could fail to be the case, I can render a reason by which predication is not necessary, a world where there are no minds predicating. So no, predication is not necessary in that sense. Now respond to my original post, please. Is that a predication? Yes, genius, it's a predication in a world where there is a mind to predicate. That it is the case doesn't imply that it is necessarily so. Are you going to argue that it is necessary? If so, render a definition of necessity, and then render how predication implies it. Be specific. Or you can answer my first post. Bert, can potentiality predicate, comprehend, about that which does not predicate, change? It is not that difficult. Trey, you asked me if predication is necessary. I gave you an answer. You asked me if my answer was a predication. I gave you an answer. Now, I'm going to answer yet a third question with nothing but questions from you, and no response to anything I've put to you. Bert, can potentiality predicate, comprehend, about that which does not predicate, change? Of course, you dim bulb. When you refer to it as that which does not change, are you predicating about it? And by the way, this thing you are predicating about as not changing, do you not say it's necessary? Is that not a predication of it as well? Yes, it is. Now, is it possible to have potential without necessity? Fourth question answered with no response from you as of yet. Yes, it is. Now, is it possible to have potential without necessity? Great, so we can agree you are predicating about this thing. Assuming potential means possible to be otherwise, and necessity means no reason by which it could fail to be the case, yes, it is possible for a thing to have potential without necessity by definition. I am, arguably, such a thing. Okay, Trey Jadlow, as you say, it's not that difficult. And would you please just answer the question? Jesus has a man nature is a true proposition. Assuming you think that's a contingently true proposition, feel free to say it's necessary if you think that's the case. Is the fact about God upon which it is contingent a necessary fact or a contingent fact? Trey Jadlow fails to explain the implications of his assertions and instead resorts to attacking our ability to predicate when the implications of his predication is vetted and a contradiction is pointed out. This is the definition of special pleading. This is very simple. By Trey's account, God is necessarily as he is in all possible worlds. All states have an explanation upon which they are contingent, and that explanation terminates in God. Now, Trey wants to say, the states are not necessarily as they are. The states could possibly be otherwise. But that doesn't follow. If the sole explanation is God, and God is necessarily as he is, then in every possible world where God is the same, in every possible world the results will be the same by necessity. If you want to assert they are not necessary, it would be by virtue of some fact about God that they were different. And that fact about God would then not be necessary by definition. So either A, all states including God are necessary, or B, all states including God could have been otherwise. I never stated or even thought that God is determined by something outside himself or that he's non-volitional. Where'd you get that idea? I made the question more succinct just above that, so perhaps you could explain where you are specifically with respect to this. Assuming you believe Jesus has a man nature as a true proposition, that the proposition is contingently true, and its contingence is upon some fact about God. Is that fact about God upon which it is contingent a necessary fact or a contingent fact? Or feel free to reject one of the three premises I assumed about your position. Or Trey Jadlow, if you wish to answer the same point, but via the line you introduced, when you say, I never stated or even thought that God is determined by something outside himself or that is non-volitional. If God, by virtue of his volition, brings about states that could have been otherwise, or not necessary, is that to say his volition could have been otherwise, and is so by virtue of some contingent reason? It would seem not, since you're saying God is not determined by something outside of himself. So if God's volition is dictated by facts he necessarily possesses, by virtue of what reason could his volition be otherwise? Is his volition arbitrary, or is it motivated by reasons? And if those reasons are intrinsic to God, are they not necessary reasons? And so by what reason could his volition be otherwise? It would seem all products of his volition are necessary as they are determined by reasons which are necessary. Are they not? I don't know why I didn't get a notification again, Bert, and I don't pay attention to but. That the proposition is contingently true. From whose perspective? Are you suggesting the necessary and contingent distinctions are subjective properties? So 2 + 2 = 4 is necessary depending on the subject? Or all causes entail effects could be contingently true based on the subject?
No, my friend, I'm not suggesting but telling you that you cannot impose time, contingent matter relating to motion, upon God. It's the same mistake you make in every exchange. I'll just keep repeating and hope it'll sink in. Wink.
Help me out here, Trey. Can you tell me from these three propositions whether they are true or false? Proposition 1. God's nature is necessarily as it is from any perspective. True or false? Proposition 2. God's volition has a sufficient reason behind it, and that sufficient reason is God's nature. True or false? Proposition 3. God's volition is what determines whether Jesus takes on a man nature. True or false? God's nature is necessarily as it is from any perspective. True or false?
True.
God's volition has a reason behind it, and that reason is God's nature. True or false?
What do you mean by reason? Predication?
God's volition is what determines Jesus taking on a man nature. True or false?
Qualifying the incommunicable nature of pure actuality via analogical language. True. What do you mean by reason? Predication?
Is God's volition motivated by God's nature, or is it without direction? Are you positing that shit just spews out unordered and unaffected by God's nature like a directionless spigot?
Qualifying the incommunicable nature of pure actuality via analogical language. True.
By the way, I take this to mean qualifying that I'd like to utter contradictions and special plead. True. Are you positing that bleep just spews out unordered and unaffected by God's nature like a directionless spigot?
No. I'm saying that logic as we know it corresponds to God, but it does not explain it, for logic for us is defined by potential existence. Makes sense?
By the way, I take this to mean qualifying that I'd like to utter contradictions and special plead. True.
Bert, I've never appealed to contradiction or special pleading. That's what you do at the beginning of the argument, however.
Oh, that's rich. So the volition with which God acts is directed by God's nature. Is that what you're agreeing to? I have to say, Trey Jadlow, it's quite hilarious to see you squirm out of committing to anything relating to God while asserting so much about God when you're on the attack. I answered directly every question you threw at me, patiently waiting for my turn to have direct questions answered, and you turned into a worm wiggling to avoid the hook as soon as you had to be pinned down to the implications. Case in point, Jesus, you say, took on a man nature. But, you say, it wasn't necessary that he did. But you assert, God has a necessary nature that motivates his volition, and this, even where you try to squirm out of committing to it, is the direct implication of your saying that there is nothing external to God by which God is motivated. So we have a God who has a necessary nature that directs God's volitional acts. God's volitional acts, like taking on a man nature, in order to be possibly otherwise, would need to have a reason by which to be otherwise, unless you want to assert that God's volitional acts occur by no reason at all. I assume you don't want to take that position. But God's volitional acts, being motivated by his necessary nature, could not be otherwise, because they would need to have a reason to be otherwise, because his volitional acts occur by reasons, and those reasons are all God's necessary nature, with nothing extrinsic. So God's necessary nature, which is the same in all worlds, motivates his volitional actions, which are the same in all worlds, with taking on the nature of a man being such an action. You don't get to have an argument for God's necessary nature being the necessary and sufficient cause of all states, and then state God could possibly do otherwise. For God to do otherwise would mean that his volition would be otherwise, and his volition is motivated by his nature, which would have to be otherwise. But you're asserting it's necessary, so none of it would be otherwise. You dumb turd. All of this squirming is just the implications of the argument you are making when you assert necessity. That necessity, that's your predication, not mine. You get to keep the implications, like it or not. So the volition with which God acts is directed by God's nature. Is that what you're agreeing to?
Properly speaking, no. God's nature and volition are identical. God is simple. Nothing outside of God makes God to be God. If his nature is directing him, then he is a composite being requiring something other than himself to give him his whatness.
I have to say, Trey Jadlow, that it's quite hilarious to see you squirm out of committing to anything relating to God while asserting so much about God when you're on the attack.
I have yet to break a sweat, my friend.
Perfect. So his necessary whatness manifests in his actions? Can we say that?
As he relates to contingent creatures, sure.
What about prior to there being contingent creatures? Is his whatness ontologically necessary as he views it? And does it manifest in his acting as it relates to himself?
What do you mean by prior? Did it ever occur to you that maybe your chrome and plastic idiosyncrasies might find some instruction in a little study of history? I know you're always the smartest person in the room, but a little circumspection might do you well, my friend.
Settle down. I'm happy to get to a point where we can express it in terms you're happy with, so consider the following. I wrote, what about prior to there being contingent creatures? To which you responded,
what do you mean by prior?
Antecedent to matter coming into existence, God initiated his act to bring about matter, did he not? God caused matter. If you disagree with this, perhaps you can explain or offer terms for me by which to refer to how your God acted, antecedent to the result of his act coming into being. Surely you would agree God must act to bring about the result of his act. His action can't be contemporary to that which follows his act, right? So when I say prior, I mean antecedent to the effect of his action. What term would you like? And then we can move on. Antecedent to matter coming into existence, God initiated his act to bring about matter, did he not? God caused matter?
No, he did not. God is not predicating things ad intra or properly speaking. He is not defined by change or potential. Again, Bert, you are trying to impose your reality of contingent being on God. Can't do that. It's irrational.
God didn't cause matter to come into existence, so would you say God didn't act? Maybe just simply, did God act or did God not act?
At the moment contingent matter began to move in relationship to itself, time was born. Obviously he acted, but our understanding cannot be univocal for our only perspective of being able to understand it by happening or predication.
To say God acted is to predicate about God, right? So we know God acted by your account. Was act logically prior to the result of his act?
Again, when you say logically, do you mean by way of predication? Some people like to make a distinction between logical and temporal order. I cannot understand a significant difference in the two, frankly.
I mean, the result of his act follows his act, and the result of his act is not ingredient to his act. Is that safe to say?
How do you understand that act except by way of potentiality, change?
Speaking from God's point of view, does the result of his act follow his act?
No. How can you predicate with temporal language that which is not defined by time?
Well, you've predicated. You said God acts. I'm asking if, from God's view, does he act? We'll take this one step at a time, Trey. I'm happy to go through it methodically just to make sure we capture what it is you're willing to say. Just stick with me here.
Again, Bert, again, God's acting cannot be understood univocally via predication.
So you can't say whether, from God's view, he acted?
Oh my, why is this so difficult? If God is eternal and pure act being, impassible, not affected by anything, not moving from one state to another, how can you, a contingent, passible, dependent, moving necessarily in states of being, describe God's mode of existence without invoking predication change?
We've hit an impasse here, so let's see if we can take another route. So you've agreed that God acts. Would you agree that no result of his act informed his act? You can agree to that, right? And as an aside to your question, I think it's contradictory to pose a God who does not move from one state to another that acts to bring about moving states. So my answer to how can you would be I don't. You, however, do, but I think we can make my earlier point without tackling this one.
If you want to speak improperly or analogically, you can say that the result informed his act. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. But please don't expect me or any other creature to tell you how God acts, properly speaking, or from ad intra perspective. It's incommunicable. That's because you're infantile in your philosophical musings, as I stated earlier. Wink.
Earlier in this thread, you said,
I've never stated or even thought that God is determined by something outside of himself or that he is non-volitional.
So is that to say he is volitional and determined only by his whatness? Another term you introduced above?
There is no movement of determination in God unless you are speaking phenomenologically.
I didn't say anything about movement. You've agreed God acts, and I'm asking, in virtue of what you have said, is this correct?
I've never stated or even thought that God is determined by something outside of himself or that he is non-volitional.
So is that to say he is volitional and determined only by his whatness? Another term you introduced above?
Not by way of movement, but he is not incoherent. When speaking of God as he relates to himself, you must generally rely on apophatic language. That is to say, he is to be described more by what he is not from our perspective, invisible, immutable, timeless, etc., since eternality is incommunicable. Yeah, we can set aside movement or change. You have, through your prior statements, said God is volitional and acts. My question, regardless of movement or change, is if the volition to act, ignoring movement, derives from his whatness. You'd not say it derives from some arbitrary randomness, right? And you'd not say it derives from something extrinsic, right? So is it safe to say his volitional acts, ignoring movement, derive from his whatness and from no other fact? No, I'd say, just like I've already said, that God is simple. Nothing outside of God makes God to be God. If God derives anything, he is composite and contingent by definition. Perfect. So his volition to act, ignoring movement, is not derived by anything arbitrary and not by anything extrinsic. So God's volition to act is derived from what is intrinsic to God. Perfect. So his volition to act, ignoring movement, is not derived by anything arbitrary and not by anything extrinsic. Yes. So God's volition to act is derived from what is intrinsic to God. No, it's not derived. God's existence and being are identical. This is a necessary corollary to pure being who is simple. So let the record show Trey Jadlow answered yes to this. His volition to act, ignoring movement, is not derived by anything arbitrary and not by anything extrinsic. And now, in regards to this, I wrote, so God's volition to act is derived from what is intrinsic to God. And you wrote, no, it's not derived. God's existence and being are identical. I can grant his being existence are identical for the sake of argument, but you would agree his act is not his existence being, right? The act is the product of his existence being. As you've agreed, it is derived not by what is extrinsic to God, nor is it arbitrarily. That means it is derived from what is intrinsic to God's being existence, right? No, I cannot. He refracts himself and his activities for us in order to communicate himself by way of accommodation, somewhat like white light is refracted into colors of a spectrum through a prism, but he cannot have any potential as he relates to himself. So the act is synonymous with his existence being? From his perspective, yes, it's a timeless act. He cannot be subject to becoming or potential in any way. Sure, I can grant that for the sake of my point. So can God be other than he is? I cannot speak authoritatively on the ad intra nature of God. As I said, we must largely rely on the via negativa in our descriptions. God cannot change by your account, correct? So he is necessarily as he is, no? You said that much before, have you not? Yes, his ontology is not random, he is logos. However, that works its way out in his ad intra and communicable reality, I cannot know, by definition, via negationists. Trey Jadlow might be the last question. Are God's actions always successful in actualizing his will, or can he fail? Or, if you want something less strict, are God's acts always successful? We don't have to speak to the will or the mechanism behind it. Bert! There is no actualization for God. He is not defined by succession or time. Are God's acts always successful? Yes, if you mean God is infallible. That's what it means to be God. I'm fine not defining God in terms of succession or time for my purposes. By actualization, I mean to say that God's acts manifest results. God timelessly acts to bring about creation, for instance, and creation is necessarily brought about by the act, aka it cannot fail to come about. Put in terms you might agree to, God's timeless act never fails to produce its intended result. I'm granting God does not act temporarily, whatever that means. Agree? Or put another way, can God fail in his intentions? Yes, Bert, I don't know what you're asking. I thought I was clear. I wasn't asking anything. I was building an argument to my very first post, only in your words. So here's where we're at, based on what you've been willing to agree to. Exhibit A. I asked, so his volition to act, ignoring movement, is not derived by anything arbitrary and not by anything extrinsic. You answered, yes. Exhibit B. I asked, God cannot change by your account, correct? So he is necessarily as he is, no?
You've said that much before, have you not?
To which you responded, yes, his ontology is not random. He is logos.
Exhibit C. I asked, so the act is synonymous with his existence being?
To which you responded, from his perspective, yes, it's a timeless act. He cannot be subject to becoming or potential in any way.
Exhibit D. I asked, God can't fail, right?
To which you responded, yes, Bert.
So here's my argument. Premise 1. God's acts are synonymous with his existence being. Exhibit C. Premise 2. God's existence being is necessarily as he is and cannot change. Exhibit B. Premise 3. God's volition to act is not derived by anything arbitrary nor extrinsic. Exhibit A. Premise 4. God's acts can't fail. Exhibit D. Conclusion. God's acts, being synonymous with his existence being, P1, are changeless and necessarily as he is, P2, with nothing derived arbitrarily nor extrinsically, P3, and with no ability to fail, P4, and are therefore necessarily the same in all possible worlds, yielding the same result in all possible worlds. In other words, what I argued in my very first post was the logical conclusion of your position, only now with your blessing. Modal collapse, with the whole kit and caboodle being necessarily as it is, with no reason by which it could be otherwise. Patience is a virtue.
All possible worlds? Is there some kind of reality in which God shops and things could be otherwise? I'm not a Molinist. It's utterly incompatible with historic Christianity. You made no point whatsoever, but go ahead and pat yourself on the back with a victory lap while the crowd cheers.
Trey Jadlow, to say all possible worlds is simply a way to say there is no reason by which it could fail to obtain, or put another way, necessary. Now, if you want to assert that the argument I strung together from your own positions contained an untrue premise, by all means, cite the offending premise and the words you would go back on. No need for the drama if in fact you can actually render the reason. What a predictable response from Trey. I'll await the premise containing the implication you'd now like to reject. Sock account spied the point. Pay attention here. My efforts were not to somehow critique this conception of God so as to reduce it. My efforts were to drag into full light the implications of Trey's views, to demonstrate his desire to have his cake and eat it too. He argues what we must imply by reason, but when the implications go sour, he insists we must stop. He pretends it is because we ought not speak beyond a line, and yet it begs, by what means was the line drawn? Not by predication of what lies on the other side, dun dun dun, any posit, whether theistic or atheistic, that involves some brute fact by which all other states issue forth, entails their necessary following from the brute fact. Such a conception of a God, that is the sufficient reason for all other states, can no more will his will than we can. It necessarily issues forth the state it issues, and Jesus can no more not take on a God-man dual nature, if that was the case, than God could choose his essence. If God is necessarily as he is, then a world where Jesus does not become incarnate is a world with no God. That is to say, God being the case is contingent on Jesus becoming man. And whoop-de-doo, if that is so, it is trivially such. But this demonstrates Trey's tender ear. When the implication leads to that which would upset, he will more readily assert one ought not opine because it spoils the conception, when it is fact his conception that is the thing that is spoiled. Worst of all, he will resort to childish games where he fancies the implication he fancies, and protect them at all costs, casting insults and admonishments over humble introspection. Trey plays the possum, touting his lack of education, but make no mistake, he's got no expectation of learning from those with whom he interacts. For those, he has only contempt. On the day he admits learning one thing in this area that he confesses to have no education in, from those he regularly spits on, it will be the day that I believe him to be sincere in his pursuit of truth, and interest in those with whom he deals. Clearly he has no room for humility when it would mean conceding 1 inch to those he considers filth. My argument in no way diminishes the God implied, nor was such a result the intent. The target rather was the man who ignores the implications of his utterances, the one pleading to have his cake and eat it too.